Hi students, this is Dr. Spellman. It's time for us to move from Unit 2, where we're looking at deductive arguments and natural deduction, propositional logic. Now we're turning to informal logic and informal fallacies, arguments where we're not trying to prove definitively the truth of our conclusion, but rather we're trying to give our listener, our readers, good reasons to accept our conclusions, and looking at ways in which those arguments can be stronger or weaker. And this week in particular, we're going to be looking at informal fallacies, which are problems with reasoning they're not formal, right? They're informal. And so what does that mean? We're going to take a look at that. So in particular, today we're going to look at fallacies of relevance. So we've got 8 of them in chapter 3.2 in the Hurley textbook. Number 1, the appeal to force. 2, appeal to pity. 3, appeal to the people. 4, ad hominem. 5, accident. 6, straw man. 7, missing the point. And 8, red herring. So we're going to talk about all of those fallacies today, but before we do, we're going to talk about what a fallacy is, and in particular what a informal fallacy and then a fallacy of relevance. What are those things? What do those terms mean? So people commit fallacies when they endorse arguments that appear to be sound, in the case of deductive arguments, or cogent in the form of inductive arguments, strong inductive arguments, but are actually unsound or uncogent. So a fallacy, right, is when we're endorsing an argument that is actually weaker than we are suggesting that it is. A formal fallacy occurs when you endorse an invalid argument as valid, or a weak argument as a strong one. So in the case of a formal fallacy, it's a structural problem. So you're suggesting that the structure of this argument is good when actually the structure is bad. An informal fallacy, however, has a perfectly fine structure. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it has a faulty premise or a weak premise, a premise that doesn't really provide enough support for the conclusion as you would need. Oftentimes these false premises are not stated explicitly, they're implicit. So when the arguments are reconstructed, the arguments look valid. The problem is just that they're unsound. So you'll remember validity. Right? In order to be a sound argument, a sound deductive argument, you need the argument to be valid and to have true premises. So these informal fallacies occur when you've got a valid argument but a false premise. So let's take a look just for example. So imagine someone says this. If someone lives in Bluffton, then that person lives in Ohio. Dr. Spellman lives in Ohio, therefore Dr. Spellman lives in Bluffton. Now that argument in a sense sounds fine, but when we reconstruct it, we'll see that it's actually invalid. So premise 1 says if someone lives in Bluffton, then that person lives in Ohio, A arrow B. And they say Dr. Spellman lives in Ohio, which is B. But we can't infer anything from that, right? If someone lives in Bluffton, then that person lives in Ohio. That's true. Dr. Spellman lives in Ohio, that's true too. But we can't know whether or not Dr. Spellman lives in Bluffton or lives in Ada. We can't really be sure just from the premises that we have here. So if we were to conclude that Dr. Spellman lives in Bluffton, we would be making an invalid argument. And an invalid argument is a kind of formal fallacy. But let's look at an informal fallacy. So here we might imagine someone saying, Dr. Spellman lives in Bluffton, therefore Dr. Spellman is Mennonite. Now, if we go to reconstruct this argument, we're going to take the premise, right? Dr. Spellman lives in Bluffton. We're going to take the conclusion, therefore Dr. Spellman is Mennonite. And we can construct a valid argument for that conclusion. So unlike the formal fallacy where that was an invalid argument, we can construct a valid argument here, right? We just need the premise that says this. If someone lives in Bluffton, then that person is Mennonite. Now, here the problem isn't with the structure, again, right? It's not a problem with The first premise, Dr. Spellman lives in Bluffton. I do live in Bluffton. The problem is with the second premise. If someone lives in Bluffton, then that person is Mennonite. That's not true. There are all sorts of people in Bluffton that aren't Mennonite. And so the fact that I live in Bluffton is not very strong evidence that I'm Mennonite. Now, that's an informal fallacy sort of in general, right? Fallacies of relevance are going to be fallacies where the premises in someone's argument are irrelevant to the truth of their conclusion. So they're just not the right sort of thing to provide support for the conclusion. It's not that they're bad support. The book talks about the idea that these premises that are faulty may be psychologically relevant, but they're not really logically relevant to the truth of the conclusion. So let's start with the first one, appeal to force. So people commit the appeal to force fallacy when they threaten the physical or psychological well-being of the reader or listener to get that person to believe something or to act in a certain way. So this fallacy is often mistaken with the slippery slope fallacy, a fallacy we haven't talked about yet, but that we will talk about later. It's just important to note some of the differences there. So the appeal to force fallacy is always going to involve the arguer threatening the listener or the reader. Maybe not explicitly, maybe there's an implicit threat. So, if you don't do this, watch out for this thing happening to you. That's an appeal to force. The slippery slope fallacy is going to involve the arguer unjustifiably suggesting that the opposing position harms society at large. So the thought in the slippery slope is not that you in particular are going to be harmed, but rather that society at large is going to be harmed if you don't listen to the argument or accept the conclusion of the argument. So here's an example of an appeal to force. Unless you want to be crushed into little bits, I think you'll agree with the climate scientists and me that the Earth is warming. So here we've got this image of someone holding someone up against the wall and saying, I'm going to beat you up if you don't agree with me and the climate scientists about climate change. That's an appeal to force. A slippery slope, right, is if we don't do this, then this other thing's going to happen, and the next thing you know, the Earth's going to melt or something. So that's not directed at a particular person. The appeal to force is directed at a particular person. The appeal to pity fallacy is committed when someone uses another's sense of pity to get that person to believe something or to act in a certain way. So we're appealing to their emotions primarily here. Now, whether an appeal to pity is a fallacy in any particular case can be controversial. Here's an example. So look at how cute these little puppies are. Are you sure we should just let them be euthanized? Now, maybe that argument, we might think about, well, what's that argument trying to say? These puppies are really cute, therefore we shouldn't let them be euthanized. And the inference, the implicit premise is something like, if something's cute, then we shouldn't let it be euthanized. Maybe that premise is true. I'm not exactly sure. The point is just that, how cute something is maybe isn't great evidence about what exactly we should do to it. So some common places where these kinds of arguments get made, right, are maybe in the abortion debate, where people depict images of fetuses at various stages in gestation, or something like factory farming, where we're depicting images of animals suffering on factory farms. Now, I think these appeals can sometimes be good and appropriate, but maybe other times they're not so good. And what we just want to keep our eye out for is when are these appeals to pity bad ones? When are they legitimate ones? The next fallacy we're going to talk about are the appeal to the people fallacy. So there are a number of ways to commit this fallacy. So one way to do it is to appeal to the listeners or the reader's fear. alternatively appeal to their desire to be approved or their desire to be cool in order to convince them of something. Another way is to use the fact that everyone believes something or is doing it to suggest that the listeners or readers should believe it or do it themselves. So this is sort of the bandwagon version. And then a third way to commit this fallacy is to use the fact that we've always done something a certain way to suggest that we should continue to do it that way. This is sort of an appeal to tradition. Now, I'm going to give a few arguments for, in defense of guns, right? And so I think all these arguments commit this appeal to the people fallacy, but they commit it in a different way. So first, do you want the socialists to take away your guns? Of course not. Join the NRA today. Now here the appeal, right, is to there's this really bad thing that's going to happen if you don't join the NRA, which is that the socialists are going to take away your guns. That fear that we're stirring up makes it an appeal to the people fallacy. Now, the arguer is not threatening the person making the argument, so it's not an appeal to force, but rather the worry is this outside party. If we don't have more people join the NRA, then the socialists are going to be the ones that are going to take away your guns. The second version, right? Everyone owns gun these days, right? A bandwagon. Everybody's doing it. If you come to the gun show with me, you can pick one up too. Right? So there's this idea, you should come to the gun show with me and buy a gun. Why? Because everyone owns them. Finally, an appeal to tradition. The founding fathers gave us the right to bear arms 200 years ago. We can't let liberals take that right away now. So this idea, we've always done things this one way, and so can't change it at this point. The next fallacy we're going to talk about is the ad hominem fallacy, and this one is really popular, and rather than talking about it in sort of its English term phrase, appeal to the, not appeal to the people, but against the person, we're going to use it by its Latin name because the Latin name is so popular in common discourse. So the ad hominem fallacy is committed when we attempt to cast doubt on an argument by attacking the person who made it rather than the argument itself. So we've got a little bit of a diagram here, right? There's this arguer 1 who's giving an argument, and what arguer number 2 does is instead of attacking, the argument that arguer number 1 is making, instead arguer number 2 attacks the arguer who was making the argument, and that's what's fallacious about it. So some ways to commit the ad hominem fallacy include this. So you might point out that the opponent has a character flaw, and there we call that an abusive ad hominem. If we might point out that the opponent is part of a different group than us, right? Like a liberal or a socialist or something along those lines. Third, we might draw attention to a feature of the opponent that could make them biased in the particular case. And then fourth, we might draw attention to the fact that the opponents don't practice what they preach, and that's called a tu quoque. So here's one example. So how could you think that a drug addict like Ozzy Osbourne could be a good singer? Here the thought is we're sort of criticizing someone's position that Ozzy Osbourne is a good singer by attacking the person. Well, now that I'm thinking about this one, maybe so here we're attacking a person and using it as evidence against some other feature that they have. It's a little bit different than, I think maybe a better example here would be something like if Ozzy Osbourne was the one saying that he's a good singer or something, we're like, well, you're a drug addict, so how can we trust you, right? The thought there is the ad hominem attacks the person making the argument, not the argument itself. And so that's not the best example. Here's a better example. So, sure, he promised to cut taxes, but you can't trust anything a politician says, right? So here they're saying, like, this person's a politician, you can't trust politicians, and so we can't trust the promise that this person made to cut taxes. Here's an ad hominem circumstantial. We're pointing to the circumstances that the person's in to discount the argument. So it should come as no surprise that the CEO of ExxonMobil supports fracking. The thought here is, that the CEO of ExxonMobil has this financial interest in fracking being allowed, and so when the CEO is arguing for it, we're sort of not particularly surprised that they're arguing for it. Now, I think it's important to remember that these fallacies are not always a problem, right? Sometimes, the reason that people reason in this way is because, like, usually sometimes it's good or sometimes it's right. So we should definitely be on the lookout for when people have, like, maybe a bias or a reason, some sort of interest for supporting a certain position. But it can be problematic as well. So here's an example. Don't forget that the guy you're about to hear from dropped out of high school. Well, imagine that you said that right before Albert Einstein came on stage, right? The thought is that, like, in saying that right before Einstein comes on stage, you're sort of undermining his credibility, even though the fact that he dropped out of high school is not any good reason whatsoever to think that Einstein isn't a reliable person or authoritative on his studies or science or whatever it is. So that's more of like a poisoning the well style ad hominem attack. So there's this way in which we're undercutting the person right from the get-go. Another kind of ad hominem is the tu quoque, and this is maybe like the most common or the most significant. What we're doing here is we're attacking someone by criticizing again the fact that they don't practice what they preach. So Peter Singer has famously argued that we have a moral obligation to donate lots of our money to poverty relief. And so some people have made arguments sort of like this, right? Look how nicely Peter Singer is dressed. I guess we shouldn't take his claim that we're obligated to donate to poverty relief too seriously. And the thought is, like, well, if Peter Singer were really practicing what he preaches, he would be dressed in rags or something along those lines. But he's not dressed in rags, so we shouldn't have to take his arguments too seriously. I think this argument's not a very good argument. There are a lot of reasons to think that what's moral is maybe really hard to accomplish, and so Singer might be right that we should donate to poverty relief, even if he doesn't live up to his high standards. Now, I think it's also true that just because you wear a nice shirt doesn't mean you're not also donating a lot of your money to poverty relief, and I think Singer is someone who does that. Here's another example. So you say you're pro-life, but you support capital punishment. I guess you aren't pro-life after all. Again, here the thought is like, well, you say you're pro-life, but you support capital punishment, so it looks like you're maybe not really practicing what you're preaching. Or you say we should stop eating meat, but you eat meat, so I'm going to stop listening to what you have to say about this issue. Again, here, the thought is, it might be true that someone thinks eating meat's wrong, but just give in to temptation from time to time. And that doesn't mean that their arguments aren't good or that their conclusion's false. It just means that they have weakness of will or something like that. All right, so now we're going to move on from ad hominem to the fallacy of accident. People commit this fallacy when they use a generalization that admits of exceptions as evidence in those exceptional cases. So in a fallacy of accident, we have some general rule that applies to a lot of cases, and so we're applying it to a specific case where that general rule doesn't really apply. So the general rule, you might think, admits of some exceptions that don't sort of get us to all of the cases, and so when we misapply it, that's the accident. So here's an example. Birds can fly, and penguins are birds. It follows that penguins can fly. Well, penguins are birds, and birds can fly generally speaking, but they can't. Not all birds can fly. In fact, penguins are like the example of a bird that can't fly. So that argument commits the fallacy of accident. Another example, you just said that killing is wrong, so how can you say that capital punishment is permissible? Well, maybe the person thinks that, like, yeah, killing is wrong, or killing innocent people is wrong, but capital punishment, right, for people who are murderers, for example, isn't really a case, it's not the typical case of killing, right? In the same way that penguins aren't the typical kinds of birds. The straw man fallacy is one that's committed when people try and cast doubt on opposing arguments by oversimplifying or caricaturing those arguments, and then showing that the oversimplified or caricatured version of the argument is unsound. So here we've got some arguer, and the opponent has some position they're arguing for, and what the arguer does is they distort the opposing position to argue for their conclusion. Let's look at an example. So I never had, this particular example didn't really happen to me, but when I went to undergrad, I went to school that was a dry campus, right? There wasn't alcohol allowed on campus, so I'm giving an example of a kind of argument that you might make in that context. So Student Senate has presented us with an argument favoring alcohol privileges on campus. Their argument depends on the claim that everyone has a right to drink whenever they want to, even babies. That's completely unreasonable, so we shouldn't allow students to drink on campus. The thought here is that this argument is caricaturing the opposing side. Even if someone says people have a right to drink, they presumably don't think that babies have a right to drink. And so what this person's doing here is sort of caricaturing the opposing argument and then saying, well, since that argument's ridiculous, we can ignore it and we should accept the opposite position. Missing the point. So we commit the missing the point fallacy when we offer evidence for one conclusion but draw a different, though potentially related one. So our premises that we're giving entail some conclusion A, over here or whatever, but the conclusion we draw is conclusion B. Now, it might be sort of hard to imagine how this argument happens in real life, but I think it's actually one that happens with a fair bit of frequency. It's like your arguments or your reasons all support something in the vicinity of the conclusion that you draw, but they don't really entail or imply the particular conclusion that you draw. So here's an example. We should abolish the welfare state, the welfare system, because it's abused so frequently these days. So the thought here is that, like, welfare is abused, and so we've got to get rid of the whole system. But that welfare is abused is maybe a good reason to stop the abuse or modify welfare. It's not a good reason to get rid of welfare altogether. And so we need to be precise and careful when we're thinking about an argument like that. Here's another one. Crimes of theft and robbery are increasing at an alarming rate. Obviously, we need to reinstate the death penalty for such crimes. So, again, that crimes of theft and robbery are increasing does suggest that we need to do something in response. But does it imply that we need to reinstate the death penalty or make the punishment for those crimes more dramatic? No. Maybe it means we need to increase welfare so that people aren't stealing and robbing other people. So there's no guarantee to get to this conclusion, though there is maybe an implication, a good argument for some other sort of conclusion about needing to do something to respond to the rising crime rates. A red herring, which I believe is the last one we're going to look at today, the last fallacy of relevance, is committed when people divert the listener or the reader's attention away from the opposing argument or position, in the same way that hunters in the past have attempted to divert a dog's attention away from a scent trail by dragging a red herring, like the fish, across it. So the idea was that you wanted to train your dogs to follow the trail, and so you might, drag a red herring across it because a red herring was apparently like smelled especially bad or had an especially strong smell, and it would distract the dogs. And so the red herring argument tries to distract your reader's attention away from the thing they were trying to argue for and diverts it over towards your argument. The way this is different from the straw man is that it doesn't involve an oversimplification or a caricature of the opposing argument. So the straw man is always, making the opposing argument sound ridiculous. The red herring is just saying like, let's pay attention to this other thing over here, rather than saying like, your argument is a bad one. And I should also note that this fallacy differs from missing the point in that it's always committed after someone else has taken a position or made an argument. So for our purposes, it's not that someone draws like a faulty conclusion from the evidence they're presenting, but rather it's distracting. The goal is to distract away from something someone else has said, not just making a bad inference or something along those lines. Here's one example. I hear your arguments against buying and eating factory farm meat, but meat is so tasty. Look at the steak. Can you honestly say that you don't want to eat that? Here again, that steak looks really good. It looks really tasty, right? But that is sort of a separate issue from whether or not it's morally permissible to buy and eat factory farm meat. So the reason somebody's arguing against buying and eating factory farm meat isn't that it like tastes bad, or even that it's unhealthy, right? Rather, oftentimes the arguments are moral arguments in terms of how the animals are treated. So the fact that like this steak looks really tasty is a totally different thing. It's irrelevant. Here's another one, and I should note some of these arguments sort of I think of because I teach this food ethics class, and these arguments come up with some frequency there, and so sort of drawing on that experience to give you some examples. So, there's a good deal of talk these days about the need to eliminate pesticides from our fruits and vegetables, but many of these foods are essential to our health. Carrots are an excellent source of vitamin A. Broccoli is rich in iron, and oranges and grapefruits have lots of vitamin C. Note that they're sort of acknowledging that there's this other argument out there. People are saying this one thing, but they're gonna like point you to like pay attention to all the nice, good things about these fruits and vegetables, where that is like totally irrelevant to the argument that's being made, right? That we should eliminate pesticides. The fact that carrots are an excellent source of vitamin A doesn't tell us anything about what we should do with pesticides. So there might be some connection there, but we need to make that connection more explicit. We need to be clear about it. So hopefully that was a helpful description of the different informal fallacies that we're looking at in chapter 3.2. What I would encourage you to do is to try and answer some of those starred questions at the end of that chapter, and to check your answers when you're done. I've posted the readings online. You should be able to take a look at those if you haven't already. And so go ahead and read through that section, take a look at those questions, try and answer them. And then if you have questions about them, right, that's the sort of thing we can check in about and make sure you're following along and you have a good understanding of the theories. Of the fallacies.